there's a new Wormable vulnerability on the Microsoft SMB protocol.
So, John, have you heard about the SMBv3 vulnerability that's out now?
Yeah, and, like a lot of other vulnerabilities on this port, it's one to be worried about because this is a vulnerability that is patched at this point. So there is a patch that was released last week. But when we talk about SMB, that's Microsoft's file sharing protocol. And we've seen other worms, notably, when you go back in history, like WannaCry was a worm that traveled across the SMB port, exploiting machines on that same service, as well as Conficker and some of these other ones historically. That would be something to be worried about. I guess the upside with this one is, well, there's a couple of upsides. First of all, it really only impacts Windows 10 and Windows Server at this point, so more recent versions of Windows. And when we look at kind of the landscape out there, using things like Shodan, there's not a ton of machines that are exposing themselves to the internet that would meet this criteria. There's about 43,000 or so, I think they saw. And the other upside is that there's only one proof of concept exploit out there right now for this. But now that the patch was released last week, I would expect that people, typically when a patch gets released, the bad guys take that patch, they look at it, they reverse engineer it to figure out what is it actually patching, because from that they can figure out how to exploit that vulnerability. I anticipate that we'll probably see more exploit attempts against this in the future. And I guess one thing that I should say is that this vulnerability, if exploited, would allow a remote attacker to execute code on the machine with the privileges of system, which is pretty typical. That's what the service runs under. But that is an escalated privilege, so you basically have somewhat super user privilege on the machine, so they can do anything. If the machine was vulnerable and unpatched for this. So I guess long story short. Patch if you can. The patch is available as soon as possible, and I would always advise not to expose specifically port 445 to the internet. There's usually very little reason that you would ever need to do that. So if you can at all avoid, exposing the SMB port to the internet from your Windows machines, that would be advisable. I don't know if you guys had any other thoughts or information that you had gleaned from this.
I guess one of the things I had saw, John, was that there is a different, vector from server to client. So if you're a server, you almost have to, it looks like somebody could send something to you, but from a client perspective, you would have to connect to a malicious server. Am I reading that right? I'm just not 100% sure.
Yeah, I believe that's true, that you would have to, either coerce a client machine to connect to a server that could, a malicious server that could exploit it. But I think, and I'm not 100% sure, but a lot of Windows machines, you can turn on file sharing, even though you're just kind of a regular machine. And I think at that point, you actually become a server. So if you're exposing yourself, like let's say you want to share your home directory or something off of your PC, at that point you are technically a server. And if you expose your device in that way to the internet or someplace else where somebody could reach you, then they could theoretically, exploit that vulnerability. That's the way I interpreted it. I'm not 100% sure.
And to your point about, making sure to block at the firewall, that's really important because, setting this particular vulnerability aside, there's a number of techniques that can be used to do things like harvest hashes and things like that at distance through, abuse of SMB. So making sure that organizations are blocking that at the firewall so that it's not egressing is really important.
That's best practice.
Absolutely.
It's best practice. You don't leak net BIOS across the internet or SMB.
One would hope.
Just like I would advise, don't expose your remote desktop protocol to the internet either. Not that it's the same type of thing, but, we see people make that same mistake as well a lot of times. But, this is a little bit different in that there's a kind of known vulnerability that just exposing your service to the internet could leave it open to exploit. Anyway, that's all I had on that one. Just something for people to be mindful of. The patch was only released last week, so people should take heed and make sure that they patch all of their Windows 10 systems and Windows Server that fall into the, vulnerable category for this.